So thinking about how they are functioning out in the ecosystem, they're important decomposers in aquatic ecosystems. So there are aquatic fungi like the chytrids, but there's a lot of stuff that lives in the water, and so we need turnover of those nutrients just like we do on land. Saprolegnia, that term sapro, right? Saprophyte, that kind of tells you what saprolegnia does. It is an important decomposer in aquatic ecosystems, but it can also be a parasite of salmon, and so that's what you see in that picture on the left. So our aquatic ones are mostly just decomposers, but the ones that have moved on land are primarily parasites. And so the important group of those that I studied in grad school a little bit are the Phytophtheras. So phyto means plant, and this crazy ending, Phytophthora, means destroyer. So that's going to have an important part of what they do. So one Phytophthora that you might have heard of is Phytophthora infestans. It's the cause of the Irish potato famine. The way that these oomycetes have evolved to live on land is that they package their swimming zoospores into this little like lemon-like capsule that's filled with water. So it is drought tolerant, desiccation tolerant, and can just be shot off like a little escape pod out into a dry environment, and it'll wait and it'll sit there and rest until water is present, and then it will germinate and release those swimming spores. They also make spores that can sit in the soil and survive for 10, 20 years and just kind of wait it out until conditions are right. So this particular one led to the death of a lot of Irish people and also the migration and immigration of a lot of Irish people to different countries, particularly America. So there's a lot of contributions to why this caused such a huge problem in Ireland. So what happens is the oomycete infects the roots of the potato plant, and then in the tubers, which are stems, which we know, it causes rot, right? And so those tubers were a primary food source for a lot of Irish people because they had to give the rest of the food that they grew to their kind of English land barons. So most of the people who died were people who only had potatoes as a food source. So that was about 40% of the Irish population. It was really easy to kind of regrow potatoes because you would dig up your tubers and then you'd have your seed tubers, which you would just cut into a bunch of pieces and make sure there was an eye, a little node on every one, and then you would replant that and grow more potatoes. And so all of those potatoes were really genetically similar, if not identical, because they were all cloned. So that made it really easy for this disease, once it was introduced, to move through and rapidly infect everything, because everything had the same genetic options of how to handle that disease, and that was no options. So all the potatoes got sick, and that meant that the food source for about 40% of the population completely disappeared. This time period was also particularly damp and cool, so when the disease was introduced, it had the perfect conditions to spread. And it was likely introduced from a ship, or it was introduced from a ship, but likely from North America. Potatoes, I think, are from Peru or somewhere in South America, so that's where you have your highest potato diversity. So Phytophthora maybe evolved there, or at least Phytophthora infestans. There's a lot of Phytophtheras. But it's unknown. So usually, or do we know that? I don't know if we know that. I shouldn't say it's unknown, but I can't remember. So that left a lot of people dead because, when it's particularly damp and cool, that's also conditions for a lot of other diseases to spread. And so then you have no food and other sicknesses. And so you either have to immigrate if you can, or try to survive, and a lot of people didn't. Another important Phytophthora, particularly for this area, is Phytophthora lateralis. This infects the roots of Port Orford cedar. If you go to HSU, or if you want to learn more about this, Eric Jules is an ecology professor there, and he studies this disease. And so these particular trees, Port Orford cedars, are amazing trees. They grow on the edges of rivers often because they like to have their feet in the water, so their roots will kind of dangle into the stream sides. And their wood is really rot resistant, so they're long-lived big trees, and they grow on the sides of the streams and shade them and keep them cool. And then when they fall down and die, they provide these interesting water features, right, where water is going to pool up behind them or go over them, and those can be important breeding grounds for fish or amphibians or anything that needs kind of a stiller, deeper water to breed in. So really important ecological features, and they are being attacked by an introduced disease. So the zoospores from Phytophthora lateralis will infect a tree, and then from that tree, they can then travel out through those roots and infect all of the trees downstream, because they swim through the water and swim toward chemicals produced by these trees and emitted into the water source. So it tends to, once it gets into a watershed, infect every tree in that watershed, because it gets everything downstream, and then it can move from tree root to tree root away from the stream into other trees. If you look at this picture, it doesn't look like a Port Orford cedar at all, but there's varieties of Port Orford cedar that have been bred to be these sort of ornamental hedges, and these are ones that are susceptible to the disease, the red ones, and then there's ones that are not susceptible, and those are the green ones. So there's some variation in susceptibility, which is promising, because hopefully we can breed these more resistant trees and get them out there. Another Phytophthora that you might have heard of, and the one that I studied in grad school, was Phytophthora Wharram. And so this is the causal agent of sudden oak death, which is a little bit of a misnomer. It doesn't really kill the oaks that quickly. They just kind of survive without food for a while and then sort of very rapidly succumb to death. But they've been in the process of death for a while. So this is another of those terrestrial oomycetes, and it is spread primarily through, well, it spreads through a lot of different plants. It can infect over 200 different native California plants, but one of the major spreaders is bay laurel. And so that's what you see in the lower left-hand corner are these bay laurel leaves that have these dead tips on the end, and that's where water pools on those leaves, and the zoospores from Phytophthora Wharram infect those leaves and cause a blight, but it doesn't really harm the bay laurels at all. So bay laurels live on, they keep spreading it, and they often grow in tandem with oaks or tan oaks, and those are the susceptible plants. So Phytophthora causes a minor blight on a lot of these plants that will then spread it to oaks and tan oaks. Once it gets into an oak or a tan oak, that's where it's going to cause some major damage. On the right, you can see a picture of a rhododendron that's infected. That's actually how Phytophthora Wharram got introduced into California, was on an ornamental rhododendron that came into the San Francisco Bay Area, got planted, and then it spread outward from there. So here we see Phytophthora, when it gets into oaks and tan oaks, it causes these oozing cankers in the trunks, and it kills off tissue within the trunk and blocks off the ability of the tree to send nutrients down to its roots, and eventually kills it. So in oaks, true oaks, that is just going to be the stem canker that kills the tree, but the pathogen doesn't spread through that oak. It's not really supposed to be, evolutionary-wise, in that tree. It doesn't do anything for it. It gets stuck in there, and then it kind of kills that tree. Whereas in a tan oak, it kills the tree by forming the stem cankers, but it also causes a blight on the leaves, and that's how it spreads. So it's kind of a double danger with the tan oaks.